So, all right. Well, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I'm super, super excited to be here with everybody today to talk about growth with no code. And I'm joining everybody today from Webflow HQ. If anybody has ever watched any of our tutorials, this is where it all happens. So, really excited to be with everyone today. So, getting started, let's talk growth specifically with no code tools. So on today's agenda, we're going to talk about introduction to no code, what happens behind the scenes with these tools, testing and optimizing with that, how I've used it in the past, and how you can too. But before we get started, hi everybody, my name is Emily. I am the director of community over at Webflow, and I am super excited to join everybody today, not only because obviously I have been in your shoes before as someone who has been a designer by trade, who's been a student, or has been trying to find their community to learn, but also because I really like growth. And I think a lot of people in here are either building things or trying to get into that job front. And I hope that throughout this presentation, this can be helpful. I've been in growth for the better part of the last 10 years of my career across a number of different organizations. And one thing that I've learned while throughout that career is that I also really hate excuses, and maybe not in the way that you might think. For a lot of folks who are new in their jobs or new in growth, you hear a lot of things all the time, like, we don't have any dev resources to build that right now, or AK, everyone needs resources, and this is going to go straight to backlog. Or maybe even that looks like a lot of work. Is it worth it? AK, I'm not sold. I can't see how you can do this on your own. And while these are really hard things to hear in the moment, they're also part of the truth of growth, where it's challenging, but because of that challenge, it's also really rewarding when it works. And more importantly, like when you are starting out, when you're in a startup or when you are new to your career, you won't always have those resources. But the beauty is you won't always need them to succeed. And that's what today is really all about. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll start to say things like no code, no resources, no problem. So with that, let's dive right into introduction to no code specifically for growth. Growth, for everybody who is familiar with, it is a healthy balance. It's not just about hyper scaling and trying to see companies explode from no users to millions around the world. It's actually a balancing act of, do you build something net new or do you optimize? And you're constantly asking that question to yourself, looking at what maybe some of you are familiar with on this left side here being the funnel, or otherwise known as the pirate metric, aka R, which you might see with the acronym, and balancing what areas of the funnel you're trying to impact and the opportunity that you have to do that impact. Whether it is working on lead generation, new landing pages, events, tutorials, or even more on the bottom funnel of referrals, partner tracking, programs, things like that, and all of which are different angles, use cases, etc., that you can use with no code. And so before we get into all of this, we might have a huge variety of people in the audience. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. No code doesn't mean that you can't code, or doesn't mean that you'll never need to do that in the future. I think the most important thing about this is that we also realize no code doesn't mean anti code. In fact, in a lot of ways, the things that actually are so exciting about no code tools in general is that they're really just a way to empower us, a way to democratize building so that anyone, no matter their technical history, can build live products, projects, or experiments. And they're a way for us to expedite proof of concepts, empower creators, your team, and ultimately get things done faster. Because just because you're not formally trained in coding or computer science doesn't mean that your ideas are any less important or any less impactful. Because these tools allow you to empower your team and yourself to level up, to break free from dev dependencies and backlogs, build technical empathy between yourself or technical and non-technical teams, and allows you to ideate, to build and test faster, and ideally realize your vision faster. And of course, I think for a lot of us here, it also lets us automate everything else. So we can focus on those big ideas. So we can focus on what really, really matters to us. And when it works, it is magic. This is normally a GIF where that poofs out, but now it's just him holding money, which hopefully is also something that you can accomplish with no-code tools. So as I go into that, let's figure out what's possible. So the beauty of no code is that it exists in so many different forms. You might recognize some of these from Webflow, of course, to Typeform, Zapier, Shopify. And the beauty of it is that there are hundreds, if not thousands. They pop up all the time. And what is so exciting about them is that they are building an entirely new ecosystem, a tech stack, a way in which that people build. And the things to keep in mind with all of those options is that there's a tool for every level of user. No matter if you have never played with one or if you have familiarity and you're looking for something to speed up your tool stack, there's a tool for every part of the funnel. The same way that we just talked about if you're trying to expand and get new users, activate them, or maybe monetize them. And so, with all of the options, what's the problem? The problem here is that no code isn't always obvious. And it comes with the same levels of trials and tribulations and building and debugging and trying to figure out ways that still come with code. And it's not always the same way that people build, even if they're using the same tools. So, when we're really thinking about it, it's important to reframe what you think about as no code. So, some of you may be familiar with Notion, for example, historically better well known as a document management or documentation tool. We're taking a look at Notion. It's built the exact same way as a no code tool, where you're building with blocks and creating things and building entire new experiences. Or here's a tweet from Bryant, one of our co-founders at Webflow, who is shouting out that 7 out of 25 of the sites on Product Hunt that day happen to be built on Webflow. So you might not even realize that when you interact with things at first glance. And maybe even its background work. Things like automating extra work or making tasks or keeping yourself up to date. And all of those things put together can sometimes take on different forms, even from taking a look and figuring out how data flows and now pairing that with a tool to make that come to life. So, for example, here, this is the flow that I had built at my previous job, trying to build out a job board for our community. And then once we had that, here's what it ended up looking like in practice. So even though there are so many different things that you can build in so many different angles, it all boils down to how data flows, how you understand it, and how you can break down those pieces. So I think a big thing to also note about this, because in a lot of cases, people talk about no code when they're building something net new. I think the thing that's also exciting is that it's not just for that, it's also for optimizing. And that gets us into a really interesting, different way of thinking about things, optimizing and testing using the same no code tech stack. And for growth, that's a really, really big function of your job. So start early, start easy with some of the things that are really dear to you. So, for example, have a ton of meetings, tired of scheduling them, using tools like Calendly to help automate that, control your calendar, make it a little bit easier for you to spend a little bit less time doing that and a little bit more focus on connecting. Or not sure why people are churning or leaving your product. There's loads of ways of doing that, from automating email outreach, sending out surveys, updating them in intercom, or even going more on the technical scale and having conditional programs or follow-ups based on the information that they've given you. And all of that are ways that you can just start to think about incorporating optimized no code tools into what you're already doing at work. And maybe you're in the audience, you're like, I don't have a job yet. I want to break in. I want to find an opportunity. I think that's also something that's so exciting about these tools is that you can create opportunity. And if you don't have that experience, I've already seen so many incredible examples of this. And I know that even myself, I got my first job in tech by creating a website to just show off why would it be important and unique to work with me. And here I even have an example of a community member from the Philippines who actually came to HQ yesterday. His name is Carl, and he created a website so that he could live out his dream of becoming a UI UX designer. And he built this whole website to talk about how he thinks, what he was interested in the hopes that he could get enough support to actually come over to the States or to Canada and to learn at one of the universities. And it actually worked, which is why he was able to come into the office yesterday. So this is also a fantastic way of creating opportunity, even if you're sitting there scratching your head on, well, I don't have something top of mind right now. And even if you don't know where to start, there's lots of ways to get inspired, whether it's checking out Work and Dribble, taking a look at templates, or of course, browsing in with Made and Webflow or different opportunities to try to rebuild or recreate what's out there. And it's not just for small ideas or getting your footstep. No code also equals real results. We have an example of, for some of you may be familiar with MakerPad, a whole business meant on creating a community that taught people how to build with no code, actually ended up getting acquired by Zapier and becoming their educational arm. Or you see tons of examples like this in indie hackers of people sharing incredible things that they built with no code, in this case, cards, Zapier, Airtable, Google Sheets, and Gmail, and actually selling that for real money, creating real businesses, real opportunities. And that's just the beginning. And so I know all of those are examples kind of out in the world. I'd love to share some of the things that I've done in the past. So some of the things, they can start small. Here's an example of a hackbot that we created. Students, hackathons. I know for me, I got a ton of experience in university learning through these types of programs. And it was really important for me to try to show up to as many of them as possible and support as many of them that we could. And so we actually built a bot using Zapier, Twitter, Webflow, and Airtable to sponsor all of as many hackathons as we could, going from 5 a year to 250 before I left at my last company. And promoting that work, making sure that the people that were building felt heard, to even just monitoring, trying to see simple things like, is my data broken? And monitoring, are there enough people coming through? Are people leaving our onboarding flow? What's happening? Um, to even the small things of, I didn't have a lot of team members when I first started at my last job. And so trying to make sure that we never fell flat on emails or content creation or following up with folks by finding ways to automate things that really matter to people and making that more accessible for more people to learn on. So that email, for example, is just a series of different conditional blocks that we used in autopilot. And all of the pieces of content that you see in that email were actually generated directly from the form that we had on Webflow. So that pushed all the info from the form into Airtable. Don't worry, this is a fake Airtable. We did not use a music collection to make an email. Um, and then that pushed from Airtable directly into our email server. So we never had to write another email again. And that allowed our team to focus on bigger, more creative projects and the content itself, like the actual events that we were hosting, or even taking a look at creating more space for more MVPs and more alternative ways for people to learn. So, for example, you can see over here, here's a V1 that we built in Airtable trying to do a marketplace. We just wanted to build ways for people to share what they were working on. Doesn't look special, but it works. That allowed us to test out, see that people loved it, and actually put a UI in front of that, which we connected that Airtable then to Webflow and made it look like this. Looks significantly better than the Airtable, but we're just now creating more ways that we can build on top of that, continue to prove it out. And that allowed us to get to version 3, which looks a little bit more productized, a little bit more like something that you would typically see, and allowed us to prove out what is now a channel at my last job, which is our templates marketplace, which is a fantastic way of just showing that what can start off as a small, quick turnaround, which took maybe an hour at the beginning, is now one of the best and most used resources for our broader community. And we see that time and time again with startups and people who are trying to create things from scratch. And it's really easy to look at these end results and be like, oh, how am I going to get there? But when you take a step back and you boil it down, often it just starts with that first idea. And Of course, all of those things can be built and can also look the same on the back end. And that's why it's really important not to measure yourself against something that looks so shiny and polished on the outside, because very often they're all just like people, the same on the inside. But that's not all. You don't have to just do MVPs, there's also campaigns. And no code allows you to experiment, to not have to spend as much time iterating and building things from net new, but instead maybe testing new campaigns. And here's an example of a campaign that actually my first no code campaign that I did back at a company called Tilt, where we were an easy way to send requests and split payments between friends. And we wanted to test out new messaging, new marketing, something that was a little bit more quote unquote dangerous or separate. And so we made a rogue website called daveistheworst.com. And Dave embodied all of the worst aspects of your friends that you would normally have to bug them to do to pay you back. And so we experimented with publicly shaming Dave, aka sharing this campaign, to talking directly about the roommate struggles that people had when using Tilt. Like, he always needs a reminder, sometimes 10, remind Dave. And then, of course, actually explaining what the product was. So it allowed us that creative freedom to test things that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. And so with that, no code, real results. Over 500 shares, thousands of comments, thousands of new users, which with a campaign that took us 2 hours to get up. And same with trying to make sure that we have more ways to build and automate, from trying to, let's say, onboard new students, new ambassadors onto our program. We realized that we could also use new no code tools to actually build custom portals, custom ways that they could learn that were outside of the product. And that allowed us to build entirely new setups, entirely new ways that they could learn about the tool, that they could engage with each other, and allowed us to build a community of over 10,000 students globally, all off the back of no code, which we built almost entirely using Wistia, WooCommerce, and a website CMS. And this allowed us to increase our ambassador onboarding by 500%, allowing us to expand globally without ever really having to lose touch with the people that we were working with. And I think those are also the things that are really, really exciting when you think about building here, is that it's not just about getting something out the door, it's about scaling the things that aren't scalable too, like creating more space to connect with people if you're not spending as much time doing admin work. And even something smaller, taking a look at just a small act of engagement and activation. And for example, this was a campaign that we did for community awards, where we had, like I mentioned, over 10,000 students who were so actively engaged in our community that we wanted to make sure that they felt recognized. And how are we going to do that? We wanted to get nominations. We wanted to get people to really feel like they had the opportunity to get connected and feel rewarded. And so we ended up actually at the time just using Yesware, which is a super simple plugin to your Gmail, and Google Forms. Um, it wasn't it wasn't complicated, but it worked. It allowed us to get over 1,200 submissions, increase engagement globally, and really connect with the people that were doing fantastic work globally. And I mean, I think the other thing that's really exciting about this is that if we were to do that again, maybe I would use different tools. And similar to kind of how all of us learn new skills, we might start off, let's say, on level one, or we might start off using the first tools that were at our grasp. As we mature and as we find new ways and refine our skills, we might refine that tech stack too. And we could do the exact same thing nowadays with, let's say, Airtable and MailChimp. And that's entirely up to you. It's your choice as you're building your tech stack. And that's what's so freeing about being able to experiment and build with these things. And so, with that, that's really where kind of the last point comes through, which is really around building your no code tech stack. It's really about not just trying to figure out what are the tools that are out there, but knowing where to start. And for me, coming from more of a design background, I often looked at ways that I could balance where do I get my inspiration, whether it was things that I thought were really interesting and I wanted to backwards or I wanted to reverse engineer and build off of, or whether I wanted to find more ways to hold that data, to get more familiarized with data management, which was, at least early in my career, something that I was really nervous about. To then finding what's the best design tool or the best way to display that information. And so I encourage everyone on this call to really think through, what are the pillars that you feel really confident in? What are the ways or areas of opportunity that you really want to learn? And what tools can help you get there? Because by better understanding what's in your tech stack and what tools at your disposal can help you achieve, you'll also gain confidence, which will help you succeed across the board. And so here's, for example, some of the tech stack that I use, really focused on design and automation mostly, where I gather and create a lot of my assets. I still have Sketch in here because I still have some old Sketch files that I still reference, but I'm definitely a Figma person now. But lots of ways that I hone those assets, then take a look at what are the fields, what are the pieces of information that I have in there, and make sure that that's reflected in my data CMS. I mostly use Airtable, and then can connect that really seamlessly into tools that help to display that information, whether it's Webflow for a website, whether it's SendGrid or Autopilot for emailing, or potentially even more ways that we might want to influence things on mobile apps or in web apps or even in, let's say, dynamic surveys. There's lots of ways that you can. And so when you're thinking about growth, when you're thinking about your opportunity, I urge you to think about what's exciting to you. Are you excited about the top of funnel? So looking for net new users, finding ways to expand, finding ways to get in front of people. Are you really interested in mid funnel, which is really more about activation and retention and engagement? Or are you really excited about bottom funnel, whether it's monetizing something, finding ways to multiply and refer more people to your product? All three of these are fantastic places to start and fantastic opportunities for you to start to play around with and learn how to build those use cases. And so when you're thinking about things, when you're thinking about where do you start, don't feel like you're alone. Don't feel like you have to come up with the most ingenious plan just to get started. Really, what you should be looking at is, what are some people, some products, some designs or projects that you really, really admire? And try to pull, what of those things do you really care about? And what are some of the ways that you could also recreate that? Because it's going to be the best way of you learning. And of course, in conclusion, when we think about no code and growth together, it's not just about building things. It's not just about trying to show off what is possible. It's about unlocking potential to do more with less. It's about expediting that ideation and experimentation. And it's about empowering you and your team to stay creative. And most importantly, it's going to create opportunity for future growth, not just in your career, but also in what you find is possible. So, with that, it was such a pleasure to chat with all of you today, and I'm really excited to take some questions. But if you have any questions about any of the projects that I listed or any of the tools, I'm more than happy to chat with you. So, let's please stay in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Emily. That's super interesting. We'll take some questions from the audience now. The first question I'd like to show is from Claudia. She asked, when did you first start, when you first started learning about new code, and what challenges did you find along the way?
Awesome. Well, hi, Claudia. Claudia also runs like a fantastic community of designers. So, Claudia, thanks for joining. I first learned about no code, I would probably say in like 2014. Um, and I think or at least formally in 2014, when I think like me actually learning came from me being in like a really tough spot. I was like a solo marketer. I like didn't have resources. I felt super alone, and I was trying to do whatever I could to succeed or make something work. And someone literally came up to my desk and was like, "Hey, have you tried?" At the time, sorry, Webflow. Someone introduced me to Squarespace, and I was like, "Oh my god! Like this is incredible! I can take things that were otherwise static in my Adobe files, and I can make them live." And suddenly those like tiny little instances started to become more and more frequent, starting with, let's say, Squarespace, to then Zapier, to then be better understanding data analytics with like Amplitude. And as I continue to learn, I think in a lot of cases, it's almost like reverse. I would find challenges in my life or career, and then I would find a tool that would help me solve that. And that would unlock more of my mental energy to find and iterate to maybe even stumble on another challenge, and therefore another tool.
Awesome. Moving on to the next question is from Vivian. So he's asking, what's the peak scale for no-code based products and platforms?
Yeah, I mean, this is my interpretation of the question. I think that there's a lot of different ways that you can push the boundaries of no code. I think for a lot of folks, it really depends on how you're building the product. Like I would definitely say, for example, with Webflow, like we have companies that are anywhere from like a one person early stage startup or side project to like Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies all using it. But it's because Webflow allows you to create like a really intensive marketing website or sites in general. And so the peak scale for that is like we will always be able to hit how much you'll be able to grab in terms of traffic. On the flip side of that, like let's say if you're trying to build a no code like entire web app or entire MVP. As you can see, even with some of the examples I had with like the marketplace, you're going to want to start like, hey, let me just validate this. Then you're going to start to pour more resources into it, start to expand. In a lot of cases, as MVPs, you might hit a threshold of how many API calls it does, how slow it gets, like things like that when things start to popularize. And you might want to start to move those over to code as well. And that's why I think it's really exciting to start with no code, but know like how far can you scale and know when you start to see some of that slowdowns, what is that next step?
Makes sense. Moving on to the next question we have from Maggie. So she's asking, what are some ways to master Webflow so you can become a Webflow developer or designer?
Oh my gosh, so many ways. So, I mean, biasly, I learned a ton about Webflow through Webflow University, as well as there's just an incredible amount of communities and streamers and folks that are there. Claudia, for example, who asked the first question, runs Floxies. That's a fantastic community, in particular for females to go in and learn how to use Webflow. I think as well, there's also fantastic courses and opportunities there, which I will let you and ADPList talk about. But I think that there's fantastic ways that you can learn, from free resources to joining courses.
Yes, exactly. I think everyone, we are going to do some collaboration with Webflow on a community-driven Webflow course, so we can all stay tuned for that. The next question is from Smith. So Smith is asking how to leverage no-code cloud disruption to scale at a fast and sustainable pace.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like in a lot of ways, that's really how you use no code within your MVP or experimentation. So for me, I often like to use or almost always turn to no code when I'm trying to first do an iteration, which allows me to speed up the time from me potentially doing a one pager or basically introducing a project to actually getting in the hands of people. That allows me to do like rapid experimentation and quicker turnarounds, which allows us to naturally build faster. In terms of a sustainable pace, I think the big thing there, similar to like any product sprint, is you want to have a review cycle, you want to have a contingency cycle, which allows you to now think, okay, do we keep piling onto that no code solution? Do we iterate on it a little bit? Or do we now start to incorporate more of a crossover with true code? So I think it really depends on, but I would highly encourage using no code, in particular in early stage validation.
Thank you. Now, I think we're going to take a few more questions. This is probably the last ones. So it's from Maggie. How do you go about creating test automation for no-code apps?
Absolutely. So there's so many ways. I think as well, I'm also just getting distracted by the chat because everyone's loving on Webflow University and Nelson, who's on my team. So I will definitely tell Pixel Geek that you love his content. He's fantastic. Um, but in terms of creating test automation for no-code apps, there's a ton of different ways to think about it. I would say like some of the examples that I showed there of even like having status bots and things within your Slack to really test out, okay, when are things broken, or alert you or give you regular reporting. The more and more that you can build the habit around when you test and you're using that as either QA, so quality assurance, or creating, let's say, streams for people to keep up to date on things, that's a really easy way of doing it and something that I always recommend. I think the other one too, which I always and have learned the hard way in the past, is using no code tools as a sandbox. So what I mean by that is that often when you're building apps, you push things directly to a database like Redshift or BigQuery, things like that. I often use Airtable as a sandbox. So I push things into Airtable so that things don't break when I play around with them there. And it also allows like a really easy to read view on are things still pushing. So highly recommend adopting that as well.
Awesome. We have a very interesting question. Is there any way to connect with Carl to hear his story as well?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I would definitely recommend Carl's fantastic. He was such a pleasure to show around the office, and like candidly, I'm pretty sure you will see him if you will tune in to our speed build challenge, which we are hosting for WebflowConf in a few weeks. But I would highly recommend going to carlkho.com. That's CARLKHO. And his contacts right down there. He's wonderful. I would highly recommend chatting with him.
Awesome. Yeah. I think with that, we will conclude the session today. Thank you so much, Emily, for coming and talk to us. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending this session. If you can help us fill in this form for feedback, session feedback, it will be super helpful. Thank you, everyone. I hope to see you at other sessions in BeMore. Thank you.